The following story was written and posted by Reddit user Alfie Kirkham. Special thanks to them for allowing me to use this story. Now then, let's get on with the show. I honestly couldn't tell you how the rumor about Mr. Taylor's roses got started. It could have been me. Like the best and worst rumors, however, it took on a life of its own soon afterwards anyway. Mr. Taylor was a fairly nice man. He just spent an awful lot of time in his garden. Even as a child, I thought it was strange how much of his life was spent planting, weeding, watering, rearranging, and organizing his garden. The other kids nearby thought so too. Like the rest of our road, Mr. Taylor's small front garden merged into a much larger back one. High hedges marked out each house, but being kids, we knew paths and gaps through all of them. It was a quiet road, and we spent a lot of our summers trudging up and down through all the gardens, front and back. Mr. Taylor's was by far the nicest. Long before growing your own vegetables became popular amongst the middle class, Mr. Taylor ran his own mini farm behind his house. Alongside rows and rows of genuinely beautiful flowers, he had a humongous greenhouse. Mr. Taylor was generous too. Whatever the season, he'd share something he'd been growing. Vegetables mainly, sometimes fruit. At Halloween, he supplied a dangerous amount of apples for bobbing. In the summer, he'd sit on his front garden drinking herbal tea he made. Neighbors would pop by and sit and have a cup. Rhubarb-based cakes were a specialty of his. Although, as kids, we despised the idea of any vegetables, but Mr. Taylor's baked items were delicious. The offerings varied by season, but every year, without fail, he'd offer everyone roses. Would you like a red or white? In time, he simply cut some and left them in a bucket by the pavement for people to take as they wished. Mr. Taylor's roses were genuinely famed on the road. They grew tall and bloomed almost perfectly on time every year. So much so that my mom had once remarked you could set a watch by them. There was a little bit of jealousy about Mr. Taylor's gardening success, but most people enjoyed the freebies. For most elderly men, this behavior would have come across as unnerving, if not downright alarming. But Mr. Taylor, as it turned out, was a resilient man who'd been shaped by tragedy. I can't remember how old I was, but at some point, my parents must have told me of Mr. Taylor's 3 wives. Wife 1 had died sometime before I was born. Wife 2, sometime after. Wife 3, an old friend of Mr. Taylor's, had dropped dead of a stroke about 6 months after they'd married. In spite of this repetitive tragedy, Mr. Taylor had marched on, throwing all his energy into the garden. He had no children, no family relatives that visited or, indeed, any friends. None of the neighbors had ever been inside his house because, apart from the deepest depths of winter, he was always in the garden. Inevitably, perhaps, because of the fame of the roses, they became the focus of the stories. At first, the roses themselves just became a pointed feature of Mr. Taylor's strangeness. There was just something odd about how successful Mr. Taylor was in terms of his gardening. It was Matt Sherlow, who lived 3 doors down, who first highlighted the lumpiness of the rosebed. "Have you seen Mr. Taylor's garden where he grows the roses?" Matt had asked. "It's really lumpy." I nodded, entirely unaware what he was getting at. "He's buried them all under there, you know." "Who?" "All his wives. That's why the roses grow so big." At the time, this made perfect sense. A day or two later, me, Matt, and some other local kids snuck into Mr. Taylor's garden to see for ourselves. Sure enough, the rosebed was lumpy. It was also the perfect size for a supine body. For the next few weeks, we got more daring in terms of our investigations. Late at night, we'd sneak into Mr. Taylor's garden and grab some handfuls of dirt from the rosebed, desperately fleeing back through the hedge before he spotted us. We never found any bones or fragments of decaying flesh inside the earth, of course, but that didn't stop us from looking. It was only when my cousin came to stay for a week that he supplied some reality. "If the bodies are buried there, nothing would grow. All the calcium from the bones would ruin it." "Really?" "Yeah, calcium ruins the soil." Whilst we didn't really understand the concept, the fact my cousin, a whole 4 years older, had told us we were fools was enough to end the rumors. Mr. Taylor was just a natural when it came to roses. We continued to take his donations of vegetables, apples, cups of tea, and roses. Of course, over the years, Mr. Taylor ran out of steam. He still spends most of his time in the garden, but the amounts he grew and the flowers he managed declined each year. "Just getting older," he'd tell his neighbors. The roses went on, however, even after I'd move out. At Christmas, when I'd come to visit, Mr. Taylor would still be pottering around getting his garden, however much smaller it was, ready for next year. It was only a decade or two later that I received a call from my parents about the old road. I'd long left and they'd moved out years before, but still had friends who lived there. It was a sad phone call. Mr. Taylor had died at 90 years old. I remember feeling quite sad. I'd barely known him beyond a caricature, but it felt like the last vestige of my childhood had shuffled off. It took a while, but eventually, Mr. Taylor's solicitors traced a fairly distant cousin. Some of the neighbors, keen to repay decades of free vegetables, tea, cakes, and roses, joined in helping to clear the house out. My mother said the house was just what you'd expect. No surprises waiting to spring out or strange locked rooms. Just a normal, if bland, house in comparison to the glories of the garden. A few days into the clean and organization, they discovered Mr. Taylor's gardening book. It was a large, well-worn binder with cartoony green fingers on the cover. Inside were endless jottings on the best times to plant, when to cut back trees and flowers, water amounts. And amongst them, Mr. Taylor's secret tips. He'd placed livers and hearts in amongst the greenhouse, carefully spread out for maximum potential, carefully kept in the fridge till they were needed. He was a true believer in recycling. He used all 6 of the Mrs. Taylor's eyes and stripped all their fingers and toes for maximum utility. Over the years, he'd perfected just the right amounts from his own homemade cookie cutters when the vegetables needed a bit of kick, and one of the Mrs. Taylor's flesh would always be ready in the freezer or the fridge. Some of the fat he boiled down and added as a base to his cakes, whilst shavings of the bones he used for a crunch in some of his vegetable pies. Even the blood he drained and stored up, a smidge added to his tea for what his notebook said was a subtle spice. In the end, he'd run out of supplies, but not before we'd all enjoyed the bounties of his efforts. I wonder nowadays how many individual bits of Mrs. Taylor's I ended up consuming. I tried estimating the number of cups of tea I drank, the cakes I'd eaten, and the vegetables and fruits we'd used up over the years thanks to Mr. Taylor's generosity. Then I tried not to think about it, but it was too late. The notebooks revealed nothing untoward about his prized possessions, however. On that front, Mr. Taylor was just a natural when it came to roses.